Something felt off before anyone even knew why. The conversation around Sophie Cunningham was already moving fast. Her podcast comments had spread across WNBA circles, reactions were piling up, people were debating whether she had gone too far, not far enough, or simply said out loud what others usually keep private. Everyone expected responses. Everyone expected headlines. What nobody expected was silence. Because the next update wasn't another quote, another clip, or another public reaction. It was a practice report. Sophie Cunningham wasn't there. Officially, the explanation was illness. That matters. That's the reported reason, and there has been no confirmation of discipline, suspension, or anything beyond that. But almost instantly, the conversation stopped being about attendance and started becoming about timing. And that's where the story changed. Fans weren't reacting to a missed practice by itself. They were reacting to the sequence of events. Public comments. Immediate attention. Then suddenly, no appearance at practice. That doesn't prove anything. But sports fans don't usually live inside official statements. They live inside patterns, moments, and timing. Within hours, people started connecting dots. Some called it overreaction. Some called it impossible to ignore. Others pointed out that when a player becomes this visible, every normal update starts looking bigger than it actually is. And that's what made this feel different. Because people weren't asking where Sophie Cunningham was. They were asking whether this was coincidence, or whether the conversation had already become bigger than basketball. The reason this turned into a story so quickly has less to do with one missed practice and more to do with who Sophie Cunningham has become. Because at this point, Sophie isn't treated like a role player in the public conversation. She's treated like a signal. Every quote becomes a headline. Every reaction becomes a clip. Every moment gets replayed, interpreted, defended, criticized, and stretched far beyond the final score. And that didn't happen overnight. Over the last stretch of the season, Sophie built a reputation that goes beyond points or minutes played. She became visible in a different way, emotional, direct, sometimes unpredictable, and very publicly willing to stand next to teammates when things get uncomfortable. That matters. Especially when one of those teammates is Caitlin Clark. Whether people agree with her approach or not, Sophie developed a reputation as someone who doesn't quietly move on from contact, controversy, or moments she feels deserve attention. When Clark became the center of debates around physical play, officiating, and expectations inside the league, Sophie rarely sounded neutral. For some fans, that turned her into one of the most loyal voices in the league. For others, it made her one of the most polarizing. And once that reputation exists, normal moments stop feeling normal. A missed practice isn't just a missed practice anymore. A podcast appearance isn't just content. A reaction isn't just emotion. Everything starts carrying extra meaning. That pressure follows players whether they ask for it or not. So before the podcast comments even happened, expectations were already built. People expected Sophie to say something. People expected people to react. What nobody expected was that the conversation would stop being about what she said, and start becoming about what happened immediately after. This is where the conversation stopped moving in a straight line. Because the thing that made people replay the sequence wasn't one quote. It was the order. First came the podcast. And depending on who was listening, people heard completely different things. The confirmed part is simple. Sophie Cunningham made comments that drew attention. She spoke about hearing criticism connected to her former organization and also spoke about physical play involving Caitlin Clark and how she viewed the league's response. That happened. The interpretation came afterward. Some listeners heard honesty. Some heard frustration. Some heard a player saying publicly what athletes usually save for private conversations. Others thought certain comments crossed a line. And almost immediately, reactions started stacking on top of reactions. Media criticism showed up. Fans pushed back. Supporters defended her. People clipped moments, reposted them, reframed them, and suddenly the original conversation started changing shape. Because people weren't debating the exact wording anymore. They were debating what the comments meant. Then came the update. Sophie Cunningham was absent from practice. Officially, illness. That part stayed consistent. But once that update appeared, the timeline became the story. Podcast. Reaction. Absence. That sequence created a completely different emotional response than if the same update had happened on a random week. And this is where stories like this take on a life of their own. Not because new facts appear. Because people start filling empty space with interpretation. Some viewers looked at the timing and shrugged. Others looked at the same timeline and felt like they had seen this movie before. Not evidence. Not confirmation. Just a feeling people attach to the moment. And once sports conversations become emotional instead of informational, they move fast. At that point, people weren't refreshing for injury updates anymore. They were watching to see whether someone would say something next. Because suddenly, the silence became louder than the comments. This is the part where the story stopped belonging to Sophie. Because once the timeline hit social media, everyone started watching the same situation through completely different lenses. One group saw a routine update. Players get sick. Players miss practice. Teams manage workloads. End of story. Another group looked at the exact same update and didn't focus on the absence at all. They focused on the atmosphere around it. And that difference changed everything. Critics of the podcast comments argue that attention follows statements like that. In their view, when players speak publicly about organizations, officiating, or league culture, strong reactions come with it. Supporters saw something completely different. To them, this wasn't controversy. This was consistency. They saw a player who speaks openly, defends teammates publicly, and accepts the consequences of being visible. That split became impossible to ignore. And then people started doing what sports fans always do. They started reading body language. Silence became interpreted. No appearance became meaningful. No follow-up became a statement. People analyzed what wasn't said almost as much as what was. That's how modern sports stories work now. Information arrives. Interpretation arrives faster. Suddenly, fans aren't debating facts anymore, they're debating intention. Was she being outspoken? Was she being unprofessional? Was she being loyal? Was she becoming a target? Everyone was looking at the same sequence and seeing something different. And that's why stories like this don't disappear quickly. Because there's no replay angle that settles it. No final whistle. No official statement that fully resets the conversation. Just a public moment where people reveal what they already believe about players, teams, attention, and who gets protected. By this point, people weren't tracking practice reports anymore. They were tracking meaning. And that's where the conversation became much bigger than one missed day. This is where the story needs to slow down. Because once reactions start moving faster than information, details begin turning into conclusions. So here's what actually exists. Sophie Cunningham missed practice. The reported reason was illness. There has been no confirmation of suspension, discipline, internal punishment, or any action taken beyond that. That matters. Because in moments like this, public conversations often become less about evidence and more about trust. And trust changes how people interpret updates. If this exact practice report happened with a different player on a random day, maybe nobody notices. But context changes everything. When a player already has a reputation for speaking openly, defending teammates publicly, and becoming part of league-wide conversations, ordinary updates stop feeling ordinary. Then previous moments start getting pulled back into the conversation. People remember earlier controversies. People remember debates around injury reporting. People remember situations where fans felt communication could have been clearer. Whether those moments are connected or not almost becomes secondary. The audience starts building a story in real time. That doesn't mean the story is true. It means people are trying to make uncertainty feel understandable. And that's where this became more interesting than a practice absence. Because the strongest reaction wasn't outrage. It was suspicion. Not certainty. Not proof. Just people looking at timing and asking themselves whether timing ever feels random anymore. The official explanation stayed the same. But by then, the conversation had already moved somewhere else. Not toward facts. Toward interpretation. And once a sports story reaches that stage, the event itself usually stops being the main event. At some point, this stopped being a story about attendance. And that's usually when sports stories become interesting. Because the biggest conversations today rarely stay inside the lines. They become conversations about identity. About expectations. About what people believe athletes are supposed to be. Sophie Cunningham happens to sit right in the middle of that collision. Not because of one podcast. Not because of one missed practice. But because she represents something different depending on who's watching. Some people see an outspoken teammate. Someone willing to absorb attention if it means standing beside teammates publicly. Someone emotional, visible, and unapologetic about it. Other people see something else. They see modern sports becoming too personality-driven. Too reactive. Too centered around moments instead of games. And that tension exists far beyond one roster. Because athletes today aren't only evaluated on performance anymore. They're evaluated on presence. How they talk. Who they defend. What they post. What they don't say. Whether they stay quiet. Whether they speak too much. That pressure creates a strange cycle. The more visible someone becomes, the less ordinary their ordinary moments feel. A missed practice becomes a headline. A reaction becomes symbolism. A quote becomes identity. And loyalty becomes something people interpret differently. One person sees support. Another sees drama. One sees leadership. Another sees unnecessary attention. Same moment. Different meaning. That's why stories like this stay alive even when new information doesn't appear. Because people aren't really debating attendance anymore. They're debating what they want athletes to be. Quiet professionals. Visible personalities. Protective teammates. League ambassadors. And when someone refuses to fit neatly into one category, every update suddenly feels bigger than it should. And maybe that's the strange part about all of this. Weeks from now, this entire moment could end up meaning absolutely nothing. Maybe Sophie Cunningham was sick. Maybe the timing was awkward. Maybe the conversation disappears the second games start again. That outcome is completely possible. But even if that happens, something already got revealed. Not about secret punishments. Not about hidden agendas. About attention. Because look at what happened. One practice update turned into a debate about loyalty. One absence turned into a conversation about visibility. People weren't waiting for medical updates. They were measuring reactions. And that says something about where sports are now. Players don't just carry expectations on the court anymore. They carry narratives. People decide who represents toughness. Who represents professionalism. Who speaks too much. Who stays too quiet. And once someone becomes connected to those bigger conversations, every ordinary moment starts feeling loaded. That doesn't mean every theory is right. It means attention changes scale. So maybe the final answer here really is the simplest one. Illness. Bad timing. End of story. Or maybe this becomes one of those moments people point back to later and say they noticed the shift before anyone else did. Right now, neither side has closure. Only the timeline. And for the moment, that's been enough to keep everyone watching.